The sharp crack of a shotgun shell being loaded into the chamber echoed through the dusty feed store as Rose Whitfield froze in place, her thin fingers clutching a small burlap sack of grain she hadn't paid for. In the dim light of the late afternoon sun filtering through dirty windows, her terrified eyes met those of a stranger, a tall, broad-shouldered cowboy, whose expression remained unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "I don't take kindly to thieves, miss," the man said, his voice low and steady as he kept the shotgun trained on her. "Not in Timber Creek, not anywhere in Montana territory." Rose swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. It was 1878, a hard year after a merciless winter, and desperation had driven her to this moment. "Please," she whispered, "it's not for me." Her hands trembled around the small sack of feed that meant the difference between life and death for her family. The cowboy stepped forward, his spurs jingling against the wooden floorboards. As he moved into a shaft of light, Rose could see his face clearly for the first time, weathered by sun and wind, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of a summer storm. Despite the hard set of his jaw, there was something in those eyes that made her continue. "My sister," Rose said quickly. "She's just a baby, only 8 months old. Our cow died last week and without milk." She couldn't finish the sentence, her voice cracking. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant sound of horses and wagons passing outside on Timber Creek's main street. Then, without a word, the cowboy lowered his shotgun. Rose watched in disbelief as he moved behind the counter, grabbed a large feed sack, and began filling it with grain far more than the pitiful amount she'd tried to steal. "What's your name?" he asked, his back to her as he worked. "Rose. Rose Whitfield." The cowboy turned, hefting the now full sack over his shoulder with ease. "I'm Keegan Dawson. I work the Triple D ranch outside of town." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and placed them on the counter. "This ought to cover it." "I don't understand," Rose said, confused by the sudden turn of events. Keegan stepped closer, and now Rose could smell the leather and prairie grass scent of him. "Take it," he said simply, extending the sack toward her. "Feed's paid for. Get it to your sister." Rose stared at him, trying to comprehend why this stranger would help her. "I can't pay you back, not now." A ghost of a smile crossed Keegan's face. "Didn't ask you to." He glanced toward the door. "Can you carry this yourself?" Rose nodded, though when he transferred the weight of the sack to her arms, she staggered slightly. The burden was heavy, but it was life itself she was carrying now. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure what else to say to this unexpected savior. Keegan tipped his hat slightly. "Get home safe, Miss Whitfield." As Rose hurried out the door with her precious cargo, she had no way of knowing that this chance encounter, this moment of unexpected mercy, would change the course of her life forever. The road back to the small cabin Rose shared with her father and baby sister stretched 3 miles outside of Timber Creek. With each step, the heavy sack of grain dug into her shoulder, but the weight was a blessed one. She adjusted it carefully, mindful not to lose a single precious kernel. The Montana Territory landscape spread out before her, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind, patches of wildflowers adding splashes of color to the earth. In the distance, the jagged peaks of mountains reached toward a vast blue sky. It was beautiful country, but harsh and unforgiving to those who couldn't meet its demands. Rose's thoughts returned to the cowboy Keegan Dawson. His act of kindness stood in stark contrast to the treatment she had grown accustomed to since her mother's death during Rebecca's birth. The townspeople's sympathy had gradually transformed into quiet judgment, as her father sank deeper into grief and drink. Leaving Rose to shoulder responsibilities far beyond her 19 years. By the time she reached the weathered cabin that sat on their small plot of land, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Smoke curled from the chimney, which meant her father had at least managed to start a fire. It was a small blessing. "Papa," Rose called as she pushed open the door. "I'm home." The cabin's interior was dim, lit only by the glow from the hearth and a single oil lamp. Her father, once a strong and capable man, sat slumped in his chair by the fire, an empty bottle at his feet. He barely looked up as she entered. "Where have you been?" he muttered, his words slightly slurred. Rose set the sack down carefully. "I got feed for the chickens and enough grain to make milk for Rebecca." She didn't mention how she'd acquired it. Her father had once been proud, and the knowledge that his daughter had resorted to theft or charity would only drive him deeper into his bottle. From the small cradle in the corner came a soft, whimpering sound. Rose immediately moved to lift her baby sister, cradling the infant against her chest. "SHH, I'm here now, Becca," she whispered, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead. "I'll have something for you to eat soon." Rebecca's face was too thin, her cries weaker than they should be. Fear clutched at Rose's heart as she carried her sister to the kitchen area. Working quickly, she prepared a thin gruel from the grain, mixing it with the last of their goat's milk and a little water. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep Rebecca alive until Rose could find a more permanent solution. As she fed her sister, Rose found her thoughts drifting back to Keegan Dawson. There had been something in his eyes, a kindness, yes, but something more. Understanding, perhaps. As if he knew what it was to struggle, to do whatever necessary to protect family. "You should have seen him, Becca," she whispered to the baby, who suckled eagerly at the makeshift bottle. Tall as a pine tree with eyes like the sky before a storm, and he helped us, even though he didn't have to. Rebecca's tiny fingers curled around Rose's thumb, and for the first time in days, Rose allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. They would survive another day. Perhaps, if the chickens laid well and she could stretch the grain, even a week or more. Later, after her father had stumbled to his bed and Rebecca slept peacefully with a full belly, Rose stepped outside into the cool night air. Stars scattered across the heavens like diamonds on black velvet, and a crescent moon hung low on the horizon. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, hoping somehow her gratitude might find its way to the cowboy who had shown mercy when she needed it most. Little did she know that fate had only begun to weave their stories together. The following week brought unexpected rain to the parched Montana landscape. Rose stood at the cabin door, watching as droplets pelted the dusty yard and soaked into the ground. The moisture was welcome, their small vegetable garden desperately needed it, but the leaky roof meant she'd spent half the night moving buckets to catch the water dripping through the ceiling. Rebecca fussed in her arms and Rose bounced her gently. "I know, little one, I know." The grain from Keegan's sack had stretched further than expected, but it wouldn't last forever. Something had to change, and soon. A decision had been forming in Rose's mind for days. With determined steps, she moved to the old trunk that contained her mother's few remaining possessions. From it, she withdrew a faded but clean dress one her mother had worn for special occasions. It was slightly too large for Rose's thin frame, but with a few strategic pins it would do. "Papa," she said, turning to where her father sat whittling aimlessly at a piece of wood. "I'm going into town today. I need to find work." Thomas Whitfield looked up, momentarily clear-eyed. "Work? Where?" "Anywhere that will have me. The hotel, perhaps, or one of the shops." Rose didn't mention her true target, the Triple D Ranch. She'd been thinking about Keegan Dawson's kindness, turning it over in her mind like a smooth river stone. The ranch would need help with cooking, cleaning, maybe even caring for children. It was her best hope. Her father's shoulders slumped. Your mother never had to work for strangers. The words stung, but Rose kept her voice steady. Times are different now, Papa, and Rebecca needs milk and proper food. We both know it. He didn't argue further, just returned to his whittling, and Rose tried not to let disappointment flood her heart. There had been a time when Thomas Whitfield would have moved heaven and earth for his family. That man seemed as distant now as the stars. After changing into her mother's dress and arranging her honey-brown hair as neatly as possible, Rose settled Rebecca into a sling across her chest. "We'll be back before dark," she told her father, who merely nodded without looking up. The rain had softened to a gentle mist by the time Rose set out, making the 3-mile walk to town less dusty, but muddying her only pair of decent shoes. She didn't mind. The cool moisture felt pleasant against her skin after so many scorching days. Timber Creek had grown substantially in the 5 years since the railroad had reached it. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted several streets lined with businesses: a hotel, a saloon, a general store, the feed store where she'd met Keegan, and various other establishments. Rose squared her shoulders as she approached the town, mentally rehearsing what she would say to potential employers. Her first stops, the hotel and the dressmaker's shop, yielded nothing but sympathetic rejections. The general store owner, Mr. Bellows, at least took the time to explain. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield, but with the baby and all." He gestured vaguely toward Rebecca, who was sleeping peacefully in her sling. "Customers expect prompt service, and you live quite a ways out." Rose nodded politely, refusing to let him see her desperation. "I understand. Thank you for your time." As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, she caught sight of a wagon bearing the Triple D brand pulling up in front of the general store. Rose's heart leapt to her throat when she recognized Keegan Dawson handling the reins. He wasn't alone. An older man with a silver-streaked beard sat beside him. Rose hesitated, suddenly unsure. What would he think of her, appearing in town so soon after their encounter? Would he believe she was seeking more charity? Pride warred with necessity as she watched him secure the horses and jump down from the wagon with easy grace. Before she could decide whether to approach or retreat, Keegan looked up and their eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something Rose couldn't quite identify: surprise, perhaps, or concern. "Miss Whitfield," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting as he walked toward her. "Mr. Dawson," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I hope you're well." He nodded, his gaze dropping briefly to the sleeping infant against her chest before returning to her face. "And your sister, the feed helped?" "Yes," Rose said softly. "Rebecca's doing much better. I can't thank you enough." The older man who had accompanied Keegan approached, curiosity evident in his weathered face. "Keegan, aren't you going to introduce us?" Keegan cleared his throat. "Douglas, this is Miss Rose Whitfield. Miss Whitfield, this is Douglas Delaney, owner of the Triple D." Rose quickly extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Delaney." Douglas took her hand with a gentle grip. "Likewise, Miss Whitfield." His sharp eyes took in her appearance, lingering on Rebecca. "What brings you to town today?" Before Rose could answer, Rebecca stirred and began to fuss. Rose bounced gently, trying to soothe her, but the baby's cries grew more insistent. "She's probably hungry," Rose explained, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I should find a place to feed her. Why don't you use our wagon?" Douglas offered, gesturing to the vehicle. "We'll be loading supplies for a while. You'll have privacy there." Gratitude washed over Rose. "Thank you. That's very kind." As she settled into the wagon bed with Rebecca arranging a blanket for privacy as she prepared to feed her sister, Rose overheard the men's conversation. "That's the girl you told me about?" Douglas asked, his voice low. "Yes," Keegan replied. "The one from the feed store. Pretty little thing. And in a tough spot, by the looks of it." Their voices faded as they entered the store, leaving Rose to tend to Rebecca in relative peace. By the time the men returned, arms laden with supplies, the baby was fed and once again sleeping contentedly. Rose climbed carefully from the wagon, adjusting her dress. This might be her only chance. She took a deep breath and spoke before her courage could desert her. "Mr. Delaney, I was wondering if by any chance you might be in need of help at the Triple D. I can cook, clean, tend gardens. I'm stronger than I look and I learn quickly." Douglas studied her for a moment, then glanced at Keegan, who had gone very still beside him. "What about your family, Miss Whitfield? Your parents?" "It's just my father, my sister, and me now," Rose explained, keeping her voice steady despite the painful admission. "My mother died last year and my father—" She hesitated, unwilling to speak ill of him. "He's having a difficult time providing for us." Douglas stroked his beard thoughtfully. "And the little one, she goes where I go," Rose said firmly. This was non-negotiable. To her surprise, Douglas smiled. "As it should be." He looked at Keegan again, some unspoken communication passing between them. "As it happens, Miss Whitfield, we are in need of help. Our cook, Mrs. Hernandez, has been asking for an assistant for months. If you're willing to work hard and live at the ranch, we might be able to come to an arrangement." Hope surged through Rose so strongly she felt lightheaded. "I would be very grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Delaney." "It's settled then," Douglas said with a decisive nod. "Keegan will come by your place tomorrow to fetch you and whatever belongings you wish to bring. The ranch is about 10 miles from town, in the opposite direction from where you're staying now, I believe." Rose turned to Keegan, who had remained unusually quiet. "If it's not too much trouble," something flickered in his stormy eyes. "Concern, perhaps." "No trouble, Miss Whitfield. I'll be there around midday." As Rose walked away from town, her steps were lighter despite the mud clinging to her shoes. For the first time in months, she felt the weight on her shoulders ease slightly. Work, honest work, and a place for her and Rebecca to stay. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she set out that morning. And if her thoughts kept returning to Keegan Dawson's storm-cloud eyes and the quiet strength in his hands as he'd filled that sack of grain for her, well, that was her secret to keep. Dawn broke over the Whitfield cabin in a blaze of pink and gold, birds greeting the new day with enthusiastic song. Rose had been awake for hours, too anxious about the coming changes to sleep. She moved around the small cabin with quiet efficiency, gathering the few possessions she and Rebecca would take to their new life at the Triple D. Her father sat at the rough-hewn table, watching her preparations with bloodshot eyes. He had taken the news of her employment with surprising sobriety, though Rose couldn't tell if it was approval or resignation that kept him from the bottle. "You don't have to do this, Rosie," he said finally, using the nickname he hadn't spoken in months. "We can manage." Rose paused in her folding of Rebecca's few clothes. "Papa, we both know that's not true." She spoke gently, without accusation. "The grain won't last forever, and winter will be here before we know it." Thomas Whitfield looked down at his hands, once strong and capable, now often shaking unless steadied by whiskey. "I've failed you both." "No, Papa." Rose crossed to him and placed her hand over his. "You're grieving, but Rebecca and I need you to find your way back to us. This job, it gives us time. Time for you to heal. Time for us to save enough to make a proper go of this place." He nodded slowly, and Rose thought she glimpsed a shadow of her old father in his eyes, the man who had taught her to ride, to shoot, to appreciate the beauty of the Montana wilderness. "I'll do better, Rosie, While you're gone, I'll do better. I know you will. She squeezed his hand before returning to her packing. And we'll visit when we can. The Triple D isn't so very far. By mid-morning, Rose had packed everything they would need: clothing, Rebecca's cradle, a few cherished books, her mother's hairbrush and mirror. She dressed in her best shirt and skirt, braided her hair neatly, and made sure Rebecca was fed and content. Her stomach fluttered with nerves as she watched the road for signs of Keegan's approach. What would life at a large ranch be like? Would she be equal to the tasks expected of her? And what of Keegan himself? Every time she thought of him, a strange warmth spread through her chest, even as uncertainty clouded her mind. He had shown her kindness, yes, but that didn't mean anything beyond basic human decency. Just past noon, the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought Rose to the door. Keegan appeared on the rise, driving a small wagon rather than riding horseback. He wore the same weathered hat and boots, but his blue shirt looked freshly pressed, and he'd clearly taken the time to shave. Rose stepped out onto the porch, Rebecca in her arms, and raised a hand in greeting. Keegan returned the gesture, then guided the wagon up to the cabin with skilled hands. "Miss Whitfield," he said, tipping his hat as he set the brake and jumped down. "Mr. Dawson." Rose shifted Rebecca to her other arm. "Thank you for coming all this way. It's no trouble." His gaze moved past her to the cabin, taking in its weathered appearance and the neglected fields beyond. Something like understanding crossed his face. "Are your things ready?" "Yes, just inside. It's not much." Keegan nodded and moved past her into the cabin. Rose followed, suddenly aware of how the small space might appear to an outsider: the sparse furnishings, the patches in the curtains, the empty bottle under her father's chair that she hadn't had time to dispose of. Thomas Whitfield stood as Keegan entered, drawing himself up to his full height despite the slight sway in his stance. "You're the cowboy taking my daughters away." Keegan met the older man's gaze steadily. "I'm taking them to honest work and a safe place to stay, sir, at your daughter's request." A tense silence stretched between the men until Thomas finally extended his hand. "Thomas Whitfield, take care of my girls, cowboy." Keegan shook his hand firmly. "Keegan Dawson, you have my word, sir." The exchange eased something in Rose's chest she hadn't realized was tight. She directed Keegan to the small pile of belongings, which he carried to the wagon with ease. The cradle was last, carefully secured in the wagon bed with rope to prevent it from shifting during the journey. The moment of parting came too quickly. Rose held Rebecca while her father kissed the baby's forehead, then she stepped into his embrace. "I'll come back to check on you," she promised, breathing in the familiar scent of him: wood smoke and earth, with only a faint trace of whiskey. "I'll be here," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'll be better, Rosie. I swear it." With a final nod to Thomas, Keegan helped Rose into the wagon, handling her as carefully as if she were made of fine china. Once she was settled with Rebecca securely in her lap, he climbed up beside her and took the reins. As the wagon pulled away, Rose looked back at the cabin, the only home she'd ever known, and at her father's solitary figure standing before it. A complex mix of emotions washed through her: relief, guilt, hope, fear. "He'll be all right," Keegan said quietly beside her, as if reading her thoughts. Rose turned to him, studying his profile as he kept his eyes on the road ahead. "How can you know that?" Keegan was silent for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "Because he has something to fight for now, something to prove." He glanced at her briefly. "Sometimes a man needs that." The insight surprised her, revealing a depth to Keegan she hadn't anticipated. "You speak from experience, Mr. Dawson." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to lose your way, and what it takes to find it again." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional gurgle from Rebecca the only sounds. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, the scattered homesteads giving way to larger expanses of grazing land. "Tell me about the Triple D," Rose said finally, curiosity overcoming her natural reserve. "How long have you worked there?" "Going on 5 years now," Keegan replied. "Started as a hand, worked my way up to foreman last year." "Foreman?" Rose couldn't hide her surprise. "I didn't realize." Keegan's expression remained impassive, but she thought she detected a hint of amusement in his voice. "Expected just a regular cowpoke, did you?" Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't mean, it's all right," he interrupted gently. "Ranch work is ranch work, no matter what they call you. Douglas Mr. Delaney, he's a good man to work for, fair, treats his people like family. And his family, does he have one?" Rose was suddenly aware of how little she knew about her new employer. "A wife, Hannah. Their son, David, and his wife, Sophia, help run the place too. They have a little boy, about 3 years old now." Keegan's expression softened. "They'll be good to you and your sister, Miss Whitfield. I wouldn't have brought you there otherwise." The simple statement warmed Rose from within. He had considered her welfare then, had perhaps even advocated for her with his employer. "I hope I don't disappoint them," she said softly. "It's been a while since I've worked for anyone but my own family." Keegan's gaze, when it met hers, was steady and reassuring. "You won't disappoint them. Anyone who'd risk what you did for her sister," he nodded toward Rebecca, "has the kind of character the Delaneys value." They crested a hill, and suddenly the Triple D spread out before them, a sprawling ranch nestled in a verdant valley. A large 2-story house stood at its center, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and barns. In the distance, cattle grazed on lush grassland that stretched toward the mountains. "It's beautiful," Rose breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. "It is," Keegan agreed, a note of pride in his voice. "Best ranch in the territory, if you ask me." He clicked to the horses, urging them down the slope toward what would be Rose's new home. As they approached, Rose straightened her shoulders and adjusted Rebecca in her arms. Whatever awaited her at the Triple D, she would face it with courage and gratitude. And if her heart beat a little faster whenever Keegan Dawson's eyes met hers, well, that was something to examine another time. The wagon rumbled across a wooden bridge spanning a clear, rushing creek before coming to a stop in the yard before the main house. The 2-story structure was impressive by Montana standards, painted white with green shutters, a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, flower boxes blooming with late summer blossoms. Before Keegan could help her down, the front door opened and a woman emerged. She appeared to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a practical bun and a face lined by sun and smiles in equal measure. She wore a simple blue dress covered by a crisp white apron. "You must be Rose," the woman called, hurrying down the porch steps. "Douglas told me you'd be arriving today. I'm Hannah Delaney." Keegan jumped down from the wagon and came around to help Rose. His hands were warm and strong at her waist as he lifted her carefully to the ground, mindful of Rebecca in her arms. The contact was brief but left Rose feeling strangely breathless. "Mrs. Delaney," she said, composing herself as she turned to her new employer's wife. "Thank you for this opportunity. I can't tell you what it means to me." Hannah waved away her formality with a smile. "None of that, Mrs. Delaney business. It's Hannah to everyone here at the Triple D." Her kind eyes moved to Rebecca, who was awake and looking around with wide-eyed curiosity. "And this must be the little sister I've heard about." "May I?" Rose nodded, and Hannah gently stroked Rebecca's cheek with one finger. "She's beautiful, Rose. How old is she?" 8 months now, Rose replied, relaxing slightly under Hannah's warm manner. Well, she's welcome here, as are you. Hannah turned to Keegan. Would you bring Miss Whitfield's things to the room we prepared? It's the one next to Alina's, with the connecting door. Keegan nodded and began unloading the wagon. Hannah linked her arm through Rose's and guided her toward the house. Alina Hernandez is our cook, she explained as they walked. You'll be working with her primarily, helping in the kitchen and with general household tasks. She's a wonderful woman, came to us from Texas about 10 years ago. Her quarters connect to what will be yours, which seemed practical since you'll have the baby with you. Rose nodded, taking in the information while also marveling at the interior of the house as they entered. It was comfortably furnished but not ostentatious, with polished wooden floors, a large stone fireplace, and walls adorned with paintings of Montana landscapes. It's lovely, she said honestly. Hannah smiled. We've been fortunate. Douglas's father started this ranch with almost nothing, but each generation has built upon it. She led Rose down a hallway past the main living areas. The kitchen and staff quarters are this way. The hands eat in the bunkhouse, but family meals are taken in the dining room. You'll take your meals with us, of course. Rose blinked in surprise. With the family, I wouldn't want to impose. Nonsense, Hannah said firmly. Everyone who lives under this roof is family one way or another. She stopped before a door and opened it. This will be your room. The space was small but comfortable, with a single bed, a dresser, a small table with a wash basin, and most importantly, space for Rebecca's cradle. A window overlooked the garden behind the house, and a connecting door presumably led to Alina's quarters. It's perfect, Rose said, feeling overwhelmed by the simple comfort of it. After months of struggling in their deteriorating cabin, this room seemed like luxury. Keegan appeared in the doorway, carrying her belongings. Where would you like these, Miss Whitfield? Anywhere is fine, thank you. Rose watched as he set down her bags and carefully placed the cradle near the bed, exactly where she would have chosen to put it herself. Alina is eager to meet you, Hannah said, but I thought you might like a little time to settle in first. Dinner is at 6 in the dining room. Keegan can show you the way. Alina will expect you in the kitchen at dawn tomorrow to begin your duties. With that, Hannah departed, leaving Rose alone with Keegan. He stood awkwardly for a moment, hat in his hands. The Delaney's are good people, he said finally. You and your sister will be safe here. Rose adjusted Rebecca in her arms, the baby growing heavy with impending sleep. Thanks to you, she said softly. Keegan shook his head. I just pointed them in your direction. The rest was your doing. A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something Rose couldn't quite name. Keegan seemed about to say something more, but instead, he simply placed his hat back on his head. I should get back to work. I'll come by at 5:45 to show you to the dining room. He paused at the door. Welcome to the Triple D, Miss Whitfield. After he left, Rose sat on the edge of the bed, Rebecca drowsing against her shoulder. Everything had happened so quickly, the theft, Keegan's mercy, securing this position, leaving her father and home behind. She felt both exhilarated and terrified by the changes. Yet as she laid Rebecca down for a nap and began unpacking their few possessions, Rose felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead at the Triple D, she would face them with determination and gratitude. And if her thoughts kept returning to a certain tall foreman with storm-cloud eyes and unexpected kindness, well, that was just her grateful heart speaking. Nothing more. It couldn't be anything more. Dawn arrived with a chorus of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Rose had been awake for an hour already, having fed Rebecca and dressed in her cleanest work clothes. Her hair was neatly braided down her back, and she'd washed her face and hands in the basin, determined to make a good first impression on Elena Hernandez. A soft knock at the connecting door made her straighten her apron one last time. "Come in," she called quietly, mindful of Rebecca, who was contentedly playing with a small wooden toy on the bed. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s with warm brown skin, dark eyes that missed nothing, and silver, streaked black hair secured in a practical bun. She wore a similar apron to Rose's over a simple dress, and her hands showed the evidence of years of honest work. "Buenos dias," the woman said, her voice accented but clear. "I am Elena. You must be Rose." "Yes, madam," Rose replied, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Elena's handshake was firm, her appraisal direct but not unkind. "Hannah says you can cook." "Yes, madam." "Nothing fancy, but I've been cooking for my father since I was 12. Elena nodded, then her gaze moved to Rebecca. A smile softened her features. "And this Pequeñita? She is your sister, not your daughter." "My sister," Rose confirmed. "Our mother died giving birth to her." A flash of sympathy crossed Elena's face. "So young to bear such responsibility. Well, at the Triple D, we share burdens." She gestured toward the door. "Come. There is much to do before breakfast. The baby can stay in my quarters while we work. I have a small pen she can play in safely." Rose gathered Rebecca and followed Elena through the connecting door into a room similar to her own, though filled with more personal touches: colorful woven blankets, a small altar with candles and a cross, photographs in simple frames. As promised, a sturdy wooden playpen stood in one corner, equipped with soft blankets and a few simple toys. After settling Rebecca, Rose followed Elena to the kitchen, a large, well-equipped space that served as the heart of the ranch house. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, copper pots hung from a rack above a central work table, and shelves lined with preserves, flour, sugar, and other staples covered another wall. "First, we make coffee," Elena declared. "In this house, nothing happens before coffee." Rose watched carefully as Elena demonstrated the proper way to measure the grounds and set the large pot to boil on the stove. Then they moved on to biscuits, bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes, enough to feed the Delaney family and any hands who might be eating in the main house that morning. As they worked side by side, Elena explained the rhythm of the Triple D kitchen: breakfast at 6 for the family, lunch at noon, dinner at 6 in the evening. Between meals, there was bread to bake, preserves to put up, vegetables to prepare from the kitchen garden, and endless cleaning. "During roundup or branding, we feed the hands here too," Elena explained as she expertly flipped a pan of biscuits onto a waiting platter. "Those days, we start at 4 and finish when the last cowboy has eaten." By the time the family began to assemble for breakfast, Rose's cheeks were flushed from the heat of the stove, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. The food looked and smelled delicious, and Elena had offered grudging approval of her biscuits. "Not bad," the cook had said, breaking one open to test its fluffiness. "With practice, they will be better." From Elena, Rose suspected this was high praise indeed. As Rose helped serve the breakfast, she was introduced to the rest of the Delaney family. Douglas she already knew, and Hannah had welcomed her the previous day. Their son David was a broader, younger version of his father, with the same keen eyes and direct manner. His wife Sophia was petite and pretty, with chestnut hair and a gentle smile. Their son Michael, a sturdy 3-year-old with his mother's hair and his father's build, regarded Rose with solemn curiosity from his seat at the table. Keegan joined them as well, freshly shaven and dressed in a clean shirt, though Rose noted he still wore his work pants and boots. He nodded to her with a small smile that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Miss Whitfield," Douglas said as she poured his coffee, "how are you settling in?" "Very well, sir," Rose replied. "Everyone has been most welcoming." "Excellent, and your sister?" "Content, thank you. Elena has kindly allowed her to stay in her quarters while we work." Hannah beamed at this. "I knew you two would get along. Elena has been asking for help in the kitchen for months." Elena, entering with the last platter of food, snorted softly. "Because some of us are not getting any younger, and this ranch keeps adding more hungry mouths to feed." Despite her grumbling, there was clear affection in her voice. The family fell into easy conversation as they ate, discussing the day's work ahead, fences that needed mending, a mare about to foal, preparations for the coming cattle drive to the railroad at Helena. Rose moved quietly around the table, refilling coffee cups and offering second helpings. She couldn't help noticing how Keegan's eyes followed her movements, though he quickly looked away whenever she glanced in his direction. It was probably just concern, she told herself. After all, he had been the one to bring her to the Triple D. He likely felt responsible for her success here. After breakfast, while Elena supervised Rose in cleaning up the kitchen, Hannah appeared with Rebecca in her arms. "This little one is too precious to be left alone all day," Hannah declared. "I'll keep her with me this morning while I work on the accounts. Rose, you focus on learning your duties." Before Rose could protest, Hannah had whisked Rebecca away, cooing to the baby about all the interesting things they would see around the ranch house. Elena chuckled at Rose's worried expression. "Do not fret. Hannah raised 3 children of her own. Your sister is in good hands." "3?" Rose questioned, having only met David. A shadow crossed Elena's face. "They lost 2 to the fever many years ago, a boy and a girl." She crossed herself quickly. "It is why she treats everyone here like family. Her heart has much love to give." Rose felt a surge of sympathy for the kind woman who had welcomed them so warmly. "I didn't know. Now you do," Elena said simply. "And you understand why your sister brings her joy. It is good for both of them." The days fell into a rhythm at the Triple D. Rose rose before dawn each morning to feed Rebecca, then joined Elena in the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Mornings were spent baking bread, preparing vegetables, and cleaning. Afternoons might include preserving fruits, making cheese, or helping Hannah with household tasks like mending or laundry. Rebecca thrived in the ranch environment, passed happily between Elena, Hannah, and Sophia during the day, lavished with attention and growing plumper by the week. Rose marveled at the change in her sister. Her cheeks filled out, her eyes bright, her laughter more frequent. Rose herself felt the changes too. Regular meals had added a healthy fullness to her previously too thin frame. Hard work left her tired but satisfied each night, and the kindness of the Delaney family soothed wounds she hadn't realized were still raw from her mother's death and her father's decline. And then there was Keegan. Though his duties as foreman kept him busy from dawn until dusk, their paths crossed regularly. He took his meals with the family, often updating Douglas on ranch business over coffee. He seemed to find reasons to visit the kitchen, checking weather predictions with Elena, who claimed her aching joints could foretell storms better than any barometer, or bringing fresh game for the table. Each time, he would acknowledge Rose with a nod and sometimes a brief conversation. How was she settling in? Did she need anything from town? Had she heard from her father? It was this last question that told Rose he understood her continuing worry. 2 weeks after her arrival at the Triple D, Keegan offered to ride by her father's cabin on his way back from checking the northern pastures. "Just to make sure he's all right," he said casually, as Rose poured his after-dinner coffee. I can bring him a letter if you'd like to write one." Rose had nearly dropped the coffee pot in gratitude. That night, she wrote a long letter to her father, detailing life at the ranch, Rebecca's progress, and her hope that he was taking care of himself. She sealed it carefully and gave it to Keegan the next morning, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. "Thank you," she said softly. "It eases my mind to know someone will check on him." Keegan's expression was unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, but his voice was gentle. "It's no trouble, Miss Whitfield." 2 days later, he returned with news that Thomas Whitfield was indeed managing. The cabin was in better order than when they'd left, and he'd even planted a small vegetable patch. There was no letter in return. Her father had never been one for writing, but he'd sent verbal assurances of his well-being and his love. That night, as Rose prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of Keegan's kindness not just to her, but to her father as well. It spoke of a character deeper and more compassionate than his sometimes gruff exterior suggested. "He's a good man, isn't he, Becca?" she whispered to her sleeping sister. "The kind mother always said were rare in this world." The thought followed her into dreams where storm cloud eyes watched over her with quiet protection, and strong hands offered support without demanding anything in return. September gave way to October, bringing crisp mornings, golden aspen leaves, and the excitement of the fall cattle drive. The Triple D hands would drive a large portion of the herd to Helena, where the cattle would be loaded onto trains bound for eastern markets. The proceeds from this sale would see the ranch through the winter months and provide capital for spring improvements. The days leading up to the drive were a flurry of activity. Extra food had to be prepared for the chuck wagon, clothes mended, supplies organized. Rose found herself rising even earlier and falling into bed exhausted each night, but the work was satisfying in its purposefulness. 3 days before the drive was set to begin, Rose was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Shading her eyes against the autumn sun, she was surprised to see Keegan riding in with another man and leading her father's old mare behind them. "Papa," she called, dropping the wet sheet back into the basket and hurrying toward the riders. Thomas Whitfield dismounted somewhat stiffly, but Rose noted with joy that his eyes were clear, his clothing clean and mended, and his stance steady. He opened his arms and she rushed into them, breathing in the familiar scent of him now, wood smoke and leather with no trace of whiskey. "Look at you," he said, holding her at arm's length. "You're blooming, Rosie." Rose blinked back happy tears. "And you look well, Papa. I've been so worried." "No need for that." He glanced at Keegan, who had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away. "Your young man there has been checking on me regular-like. Brought me supplies, helped me fix that roof that's been leaking since spring." Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks at the words "your young man," but before she could correct her father, Hannah emerged from the house with Rebecca in her arms. "Thomas," she called, "you're just in time for lunch, and look who's eager to see her papa." As Thomas took Rebecca from Hannah, exclaiming over how much she'd grown, Rose turned to Keegan. "You never told me you were helping him," she said quietly. Keegan shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Wasn't much. Just stopped by when I was in the area." "The roof needed fixing for months. That's not just stopping by." He shrugged, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. "Man needs a sound roof over his head, especially with winter coming." Before Rose could press him further, Douglas appeared and welcomed Thomas heartily. "Just the man we need. I was telling Keegan yesterday that we're short-handed for this drive. With Peterson laid up with that broken arm and Rodriguez down with fever, we could use another experienced hand." Thomas straightened, pride evident in his bearing. Been on a few cattle drives in my day. Would be honored to help if you'll have me. Excellent, Douglas clapped him on the shoulder. We leave in 3 days. Until then, you'll stay here, of course. We can put you up in the bunkhouse with the other hands. As the men moved toward the house, discussing the details of the upcoming drive, Hannah fell into step beside Rose. Keegan's been visiting your father every week since you came to us, she said softly. Taking supplies, helping with repairs. He didn't want you to worry. Rose watched Keegan's tall figure as he walked ahead with her father and Douglas, something warm unfurling in her chest. He's a good man. Hannah's knowing smile suggested she heard all that Rose wasn't saying. One of the best, loyal to a fault and kind in ways he tries to hide. She patted Rose's arm. Douglas says he's never seen Keegan take such an interest in anyone's welfare before. The implication in Hannah's words sent a flutter through Rose's stomach. She'd been careful to keep her growing feelings for Keegan hidden, convinced they were one-sided. Could it be possible that he felt something too? The thought accompanied her through the busy days that followed. Thomas integrated seamlessly into the preparations for the drive, his experience and renewed vigor making him a welcome addition to the crew. Rose watched with pride as her father worked alongside men many years his junior, holding his own and earning their respect. And if she also watched Keegan the way he led with quiet authority, the respect the other hands showed him, the rare smile that transformed his serious face, who could blame her? She told herself it was simple appreciation for all he'd done for her family. Nothing more. The night before the drive was to begin, Alina and Rose outdid themselves preparing a feast for the hands: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, apple pies. The mood in the bunkhouse, where the meal was served, was jovial despite the hard work that lay ahead. Men swapped stories of previous drives, boasted of their riding skills, and teased each other good-naturedly. Rose moved among them, refilling coffee cups and offering second helpings of pie. When she reached Keegan, who sat somewhat apart with her father and Douglas, he looked up with that small smile that never failed to quicken her pulse. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "your apple pie would make angels weep." The compliment, delivered in his usual straightforward manner, brought warmth to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson. I hope it sustains you on the trail." Thomas looked between them, a knowing gleam in his eye that Rose studiously ignored. As the evening wound down and the men began to prepare for an early night, Rose found herself unexpectedly alone with Keegan near the cookhouse. She had just emptied a basin of dishwater when he approached, hat in hand. "Miss Whitfield," he began, then paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Rose, I wanted to speak with you before we leave tomorrow." The use of her given name, the first time he'd called her anything but Miss Whitfield, made her heart skip. "Yes. The cattle drive will take about 2 weeks if the weather holds." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I've made arrangements for your father's cabin to be properly provisioned while he's gone. Jenkins and his boys will look in on the place, make sure nothing happens to it." Rose was touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's very kind of you. I've been worried about leaving it empty for so long." "It's nothing," he said dismissively, "but there's something else. When we return—" He stopped, took a breath, and started again. "When we return, with your permission, I'd like to call on you, properly." Rose stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "Call on me?" Keegan met her gaze directly now, his eyes serious in the lantern light. "Yes, I understand if you don't feel the same way or if it's too soon. You've been through a lot and I wouldn't want to pressure you. But I've come to admire you greatly, Rose. Your courage, your devotion to your family, your gentle spirit. If you'd allow me the chance to court you properly, I'd be honored." Joy bloomed in Rose's chest like a flower opening to the sun. "I would like that very much, Keegan," she said softly. The smile that spread across his face then was unlike any she'd seen before, wide and unguarded, transforming his usually serious countenance. "You would?" Rose nodded, unable to suppress her own smile. "I would." For a moment they simply stood there, grinning at each other like fools in the gathering darkness. Then Keegan seemed to remember himself and cleared his throat. "Well then, I should let you get some rest. Dawn comes early." "Yes, it does," Rose agreed, though sleep seemed impossible with her heart soaring as it was. Keegan placed his hat back on his head then, in a gesture that surprised her, gently took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a light kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Rose. Sweet dreams." As he walked away toward the bunkhouse, Rose remained rooted to the spot, her hand tingling where his lips had touched it. For the first time since her mother's death, the future seemed to hold not just duty and struggle, but the possibility of joy. The morning of the cattle drive's departure dawned clear and cool, with a hint of frost silvering the grass. Rose had been up since before dawn, helping Alina prepare breakfast for the hands and pack the last supplies for the chuck wagon. The atmosphere was one of controlled excitement, men checking gear, horses being saddled, last-minute instructions exchanged. Rose found her father by the corral, tightening the cinch on a sturdy bay gelding Douglas had assigned him for the drive. Thomas looked more like himself than he had in months, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, his posture straight and purposeful. "Be careful out there, Papa," Rose said, handing him a small package of biscuits and jerky for the first day's ride. Thomas tucked the food into his saddlebag and turned to embrace her. "I will, Rosie. Don't you worry about me. I've got something to come back to now." He glanced meaningfully over her shoulder, and Rose turned to see Keegan approaching, leading his own horse. "Mr. Dawson," Thomas said, extending his hand. "I believe I have you to thank for this opportunity." Keegan shook his hand firmly. "You earned it yourself, sir. Douglas doesn't take men on charity." Thomas nodded, accepting the compliment with dignity. "All the same, I'm grateful." He looked between Keegan and Rose, a knowing smile touching his lips. "I'll just go check if Douglas has any last instructions for me." As he walked away, leaving them alone by the corral, Rose felt suddenly shy. The previous night's conversation seemed almost dreamlike in the clear light of morning. "Did you sleep well?" Keegan asked, his voice low. "Well enough," Rose replied. In truth, she had lain awake for hours, replaying his words, the touch of his lips on her hand. "I wanted to give you something before I leave." Keegan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, which he pressed into her palm. "It's not much, but I thought you might like it." Rose opened her hand to find a small wooden carving of a rose, simple but beautifully crafted, with delicate petals and a slender stem. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her finger over the smooth surface. Keegan nodded, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "Whittling helps pass the time on watch. I'm not as skilled as some, but it's beautiful," Rose interrupted, closing her fingers around the carving. "Thank you." A call from Douglas signaled that it was time to move out. Keegan hesitated then, with a quick glance around to ensure they weren't being closely observed. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Rose's cheek. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," he said softly. Rose touched her cheek where his lips had been. "I'll be waiting." With a final nod, Keegan mounted his horse and rode to the front of the assembling herd, where Douglas and David were already issuing instructions to the hands. Thomas gave Rose a wave and a smile before taking his position as well. Rose stood with Hannah, Sophia, Alina, Rebecca, and little Michael at the edge of the yard, watching as the massive herd began to move out, nearly 1,000 cattle heading for the railroad at Helena, guided by 20 riders including her father and Keegan. "They'll be fine," Hannah assured her, linking her arm through Rose's. "Douglas has been doing this for 30 years without losing a man. And Keegan is the most capable foreman we've ever had," Sophia added. "He won't let anything happen to your father." Rose nodded, grateful for their reassurance, though a knot of worry remained in her stomach. Cattle drives were dangerous stampedes, river crossings, bandits, and unpredictable weather all posed threats. "Come," Alina said practically as the last riders disappeared over the rise. "There is still work to be done, with or without the men." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Without the men to feed and care for, the women focused on preparing for winter, preserving the last of the garden's bounty, making soap, mending clothes, and deep cleaning the house. Rose threw herself into the work, finding that physical exhaustion helped quiet her worried mind and made sleep come more easily. Rebecca continued to thrive, now crawling everywhere and pulling herself up on furniture, babbling happily to anyone who would listen. Michael had appointed himself her protector, solemnly explaining ranch life to the baby as if she could understand every word. On the evening of the 12th day after the drive's departure, as Rose was helping Alina knead bread for the next morning, Hannah burst into the kitchen. "Rider coming," she announced. "One of ours, by the look of him." Rose's heart leapt to her throat as she hurriedly wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and followed Hannah to the porch. A lone horseman was approaching at a steady pace, and as he drew nearer, Rose recognized Jenkins, one of the younger hands who had accompanied the drive. "Mrs. Delaney," he called as he reined in his lathered horse. "Mr. Delaney sent me ahead. They're about half a day behind, should be here by morning. Drive was successful, got a good price for the cattle." "Thank God," Hannah said fervently. "Everyone all right?" Jenkins dismounted, accepting the canteen of water Sophia offered him. "Yes, madam. Had a bit of trouble at the Snake River crossing, lost a few head, but no men. Then there was that stampede 3 nights ago, but Keegan and Mr. Whitfield managed to turn the herd before they ran too far." At the mention of her father and Keegan, Rose's hands clenched in her apron. "They're both well," Jenkins nodded, taking a long drink before answering. "Yes, Miss Whitfield. Your pa proved his worth. Mr. Delaney says he's got a permanent place here if he wants it." Relief washed through Rose, leaving her momentarily lightheaded. They were safe. The drive had been successful, and her father had earned a place at the Triple D. It was more than she could have hoped for. That night, Rose found sleep impossible. She checked on Rebecca repeatedly, straightened her already tidy room, and finally gave up and went to sit on the porch, watching the eastern horizon for the first hint of dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats and men's voices. Rose stood, straining her eyes in the pre-dawn darkness. Gradually, shapes emerged from the gloom: riders, horses, Douglas's familiar figure at the front. And then she saw him, Keegan, riding slightly behind Douglas, his straight posture unmistakable even in the dim light. Beside him rode her father, the two men apparently deep in conversation. Rose didn't realize she had started running until she was halfway across the yard. Thomas spotted her first, a grin breaking across his weary face as he dismounted and opened his arms. She flew into his embrace, breathing in the dust and leather scent of him. "You're safe," she murmured against his shoulder. "Told you not to worry, didn't I?" Thomas replied, his voice rough with exhaustion but filled with satisfaction. Over her father's shoulder, Rose's eyes met Keegan's. He had dismounted as well but hung back, giving them their moment of reunion. The look in his eyes, however, told her all she needed to know. He had been counting the miles home to her as eagerly as she had been counting the days until his return. As the ranch came to life around them, Hannah and Sophia emerging to greet their husbands, Alina directing the preparation of a welcome home breakfast. Hands taking care of tired horses, Rose felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This place, these people, had become home in a way she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. And Keegan Dawson, watching her with those storm cloud eyes that now held the promise of clear skies ahead, had become something she had never dared to hope for, a future filled with possibility and love. The weeks following the cattle drive brought changes to the Triple D. With winter approaching, the rhythm of ranch work shifted from the frenetic pace of summer and fall to the more measured tasks of cold weather preparation. Hay had to be stored, buildings weatherproofed, livestock brought in from distant pastures to closer grazing grounds. For Rose, the most significant change was her father's permanent presence at the ranch. Thomas Whitfield had accepted Douglas's offer of employment without hesitation, moving into the bunkhouse with the other hands. Their old cabin was closed up for the winter, with plans to return in the spring to collect any remaining possessions they might want. "No sense in you girls being split between two places," Thomas had said when Rose expressed concern about abandoning their home. "That cabin holds too many ghosts, Rosie. Maybe someday it'll be a home again, but for now, we both belong here." Rose couldn't disagree. The Triple D had brought healing to both of them in different ways, giving her father purpose and sobriety, giving her security and hope. And then there was Keegan. True to his word, he began courting her properly after their return from the cattle drive. Their busy schedules meant that courting often took unconventional forms, walking together to check on a new litter of barn kittens. Keegan teaching Rose to ride better on one of the gentler mares, stolen conversations while she hung laundry and he mended tack nearby. Sunday afternoons became their special time. After church in Timber Creek, when the ranch work slowed to essential tasks only, Keegan would take Rose for drives in the buggy, sometimes with Rebecca accompanying them, sometimes with the baby left in Alina's capable hands. During these drives, Rose learned Keegan's story, how he had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, drifting from ranch to ranch until finding a home at the Triple D. How he had worked his way up from hand to foreman through dedication and hard work. How Douglas had become a father figure to him after his own had died at Gettysburg. In turn, Rose shared her own history, happy memories of her mother, the struggles after her death, her fears for Rebecca's future before the Triple D had offered them sanctuary. "I've never told anyone about that day in the feed store," she admitted during one of their drives as the buggy followed a track along the creek. "How ashamed I felt, resorting to stealing." Keegan's hands were steady on the reins, his shoulder warm against hers in the crisp November air. "There's no shame in doing what you must for family, Rose. You were brave." "I was desperate," she corrected. "If you hadn't been there, if you'd been someone else. But I was there," he interrupted gently. "And I'd like to think it wasn't just chance that brought us together that day." Rose looked up at him, at the strong profile softened by emotion as he glanced down at her. "What would you call it then? Providence, maybe." A small smile touched his lips. "My mother would have called it the Lord's work." "And what do you call it?" Rose asked softly. Keegan's eyes held hers, serious and certain. "The best day of my life. The day I found you." The simple sincerity of his words took Rose's breath away. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her fingers. Keegan brought the buggy to a halt beneath a stand of cottonwoods. For a moment, neither moved, the only sounds the gentle gurgle of the creek and the occasional stamp of the horse's hoof. "Rose," Keegan said, his voice lower now, "may I kiss you?" The proper young woman Rose had been raised to be should have been scandalized by such a forward question. But the woman she had become stronger, more certain of herself, and her heart simply nodded. Keegan leaned down, one hand coming up to cradle her cheek with infinite gentleness. His lips, when they met hers, were warm despite the chill in the air. The kiss was tender, restrained over almost before it began, but it left Rose breathless all the same. When Keegan drew back, his eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of regret. Finding none, he smiled that rare, full smile that transformed his face and made Rose's heart skip. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you walked onto the Triple D with Rebecca in your arms," he confessed. Rose felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I've wanted you to," she admitted, "though I didn't think you felt the same way." Keegan laughed softly, the sound as rare and precious as his smile. "For a woman who sees so much, you missed how I couldn't keep my eyes off you from the first moment. Douglas teased me mercilessly about it." "Hannah did the same to me," Rose said, smiling at the memory of the older woman's knowing looks and gentle hints. They drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence. Keegan's arm now draped lightly around Rose's shoulders, her head occasionally resting against him. Something had shifted between them, a barrier crossed, a new understanding reached. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, now stretched before Rose like a path leading somewhere wonderful. Winter descended on the Triple D with a heavy snowfall in early December. The world outside the ranch house windows turned white and silent, the routine of ranch life adapting to the harsher conditions. Hands spent more time in the barn than on the range, caring for livestock, repairing equipment, and preparing for spring. Inside the main house, preparations for Christmas occupied the women. This would be Rose and Rebecca's first Christmas at the Triple D, and Hannah was determined to make it special. "We always celebrate properly," she explained as she directed Rose and Sophia in hanging evergreen boughs along the staircase. "Douglas's mother started the tradition, and I've kept it going. Everyone deserves some brightness in the darkest part of winter." Rose couldn't remember the last truly festive Christmas her family had celebrated. After her mother's death, the holiday had passed with little acknowledgement beyond a small gift for her father and prayers at church. The idea of a real celebration with decorations, special foods, and gifts filled her with childlike excitement. The day before Christmas Eve, as Rose was helping Alina prepare dough for holiday bread, Keegan appeared in the kitchen doorway. Snow dusted his coat and hat, and his cheeks were red from the cold. "Miss Whitfield," he said formally, aware of Alina's presence, "might I have a word?" Alina made a shooing motion with her floury hands. "Go, the bread will wait." Rose wiped her hands on her apron and followed Keegan to the relative privacy of the hallway. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as nervousness. "I wanted to ask if you'd accompany me on a ride tomorrow morning. There's something I'd like to show you, tomorrow, but it's Christmas Eve, there's so much to do. I've already spoken to Hannah. She says she can spare you for a few hours in the morning," he smiled slightly. "And I've promised to have you back well before the festivities begin." Curiosity piqued, Rose nodded. "All right. What time?" "After breakfast. Dress warmly, we'll be taking the sleigh." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the snow-covered landscape glittering like diamonds under a bright blue sky. After helping with breakfast and ensuring Rebecca was contentedly playing with Michael under Sophia's watchful eye, Rose bundled up in her warmest clothes and met Keegan by the barn. The sleigh he had mentioned was a small cutter designed for 2 passengers, painted a cheerful red with brass fittings that gleamed in the sunlight. A sturdy chestnut horse was already hitched, its breath forming white clouds in the frosty air. "This is lovely," Rose said as Keegan helped her into the sleigh and tucked a thick fur robe around her legs. "Where are we going? You'll see," he replied with an uncharacteristic air of mystery, climbing in beside her and taking up the reins. They glided away from the ranch, the sleigh's runners making a soft, swishing sound over the packed snow. Rose marveled at the beauty of the winter landscape, rolling hills draped in white, stands of pine and aspen creating dark and light patterns against the snow, the distant mountains sharp and clear against the blue sky. After about 20 minutes, Keegan guided the sleigh onto a less traveled track that led toward a grove of pines. As they approached, Rose could see a small cabin nestled among the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. "Whose place is this?" she asked, not recognizing it as belonging to any of the Triple D hands. Keegan reined in the horse and set the brake before turning to her with an expression that mingled nervousness and hope. "It could be ours, if you want it to be." Rose stared at him, not comprehending at first. "What do you mean? This land belongs to the Triple D," Keegan explained, taking her gloved hands in his. "Douglas gave me permission to build here last spring before I even met you. I've been working on the cabin whenever I could spare time." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I always planned to have a place of my own someday. Now I'm hoping it might be a home for us, you, me, and Rebecca." Understanding dawned and Rose's heart began to race. "Keegan, are you asking you to marry me?" "Yes, I am." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know it hasn't been that long, and if you think it's too soon, I'll wait. But I love you, Rose Whitfield. I think I started falling in love with you that day in the feed store when you were willing to risk everything for your sister. I want to spend my life with you, helping you care for Rebecca, maybe having children of our own someday. I want to wake up beside you every morning and thank God for bringing you into my life." Tears filled Rose's eyes, blurring her vision of his beloved face. "Oh, Keegan." Worry crossed his features. "If you're not ready," Rose silenced him by pulling one hand free and pressing her fingers to his lips. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The worry in his eyes transformed to joy. Reaching into his coat pocket, he withdrew a small box. "I have something for you. It was my mother's." Inside the box was a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It's beautiful," Rose whispered as Keegan slipped it onto her finger over her glove. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, then laughed softly. "Listen to me, I sound like one of those dime novels Sophia's always reading." "I like it," Rose assured him, leaning forward to kiss him softly. "And I love you, Keegan Dawson." After a moment, Keegan nodded toward the cabin. "Would you like to see inside?" "It's not finished yet, but it will be by spring if that suits you for a wedding." Rose nodded eagerly, and Keegan helped her from the sleigh. Hand in hand, they approached the cabin, their future home. The interior was simple but well crafted, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and two smaller rooms off to one side. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, warming the space. "Douglas and David helped with the chimney," Keegan explained as he showed her around. "Thomas has been lending a hand with the interior work. He's quite skilled with woodworking." "Papa knew about this?" Rose asked, surprised. Keegan nodded, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "I asked for his blessing 2 weeks ago. He gave it readily, said he'd never seen you happier than you've been these past months." Rose turned slowly in the center of the main room, taking in the wooden floors, the sturdy walls, the windows that would let in ample light. "It's perfect, Keegan. Absolutely perfect." "This room will be Rebecca's," he said, showing her the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "And when she's older, or if we have more children, we can add on. There's plenty of space." the casual way he included Rebecca in their future, the easy assumption that her sister would always be part of their family, filled Rose's heart to bursting. This was the man she had dreamed of, but never truly believed she would find one who would love not only her, but also the child who depended on her. As they prepared to leave, Keegan paused at the door, looking back at the cabin. "I know it's not much compared to what some women might want. It's everything I could ever want," Rose interrupted firmly. "A home built with love, a place for our family to grow." She squeezed his hand. "I never dreamed I could be this happy." The sleigh ride back to the Triple D was filled with plans and dreams: when they would marry, April when the wildflowers began to bloom, where they would honeymoon, a brief trip to Helena, which Rose had never visited, how Rebecca would adjust to their new home with ease, they both believed, as she already adored Keegan. As the ranch buildings came into view, Rose looked down at the ring glinting on her finger and then up at the man beside her, the man who had caught her stealing feed for her baby sister, and instead of punishment, had offered mercy, and then love beyond anything she could have imagined. "Thank you," she said softly. Keegan glanced at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For filling that sack and letting me go, for changing our lives that day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "For giving us a future." Keegan's arm tightened around her as the sleigh glided across the snow toward home. "No, Rose. Thank you for stealing that feed. It led me to the greatest treasure I could ever find." April 18, 1879, dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new grass and early wildflowers. Rose stood at the window of her room at the Triple D, watching as the ranch slowly came to life with the rising sun. This was the last morning she would wake in this room, the last day she would be Rose Whitfield. By sunset, she would be Rose Dawson, wife of Keegan Dawson, foreman of the Triple D and the man who had stolen her heart. A soft knock at the door preceded Hannah's entrance, her arms full of wildflowers freshly picked from the meadows surrounding the ranch. "For your hair," she explained, setting the blooms on the dresser. "Every bride should have flowers on her wedding day." Rose turned from the window, emotion tightening her throat. "Hannah, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us. Taking us in, making us part of your family." Hannah waved away her words, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. "You are family, my dear. From the moment Keegan brought you here, dusty and determined with that precious baby in your arms, you belonged at the Triple D." A wail from the cradle announced that Rebecca was awake and ready to join the day's excitement. Rose lifted her sister, now a sturdy 10-month-old who had recently taken her first tottering steps. "And you, little miss," Hannah said, tickling Rebecca under the chin, "are going to be the prettiest flower girl Timber Creek has ever seen." After breakfast, the women of the Triple D rallied to help Rose prepare for the ceremony, which would take place at the small church in town. Elena pressed Rose's wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that Sophia had helped her make. Hannah arranged the wildflowers into a crown for Rose's hair and a small bouquet. Even 4-year-old Michael contributed, solemnly presenting Rose with a smooth river stone for luck, which she tucked into her pocket with equal solemnity. Through it all, Rose felt a sense of calm certainty. The nervousness she had expected never materialized. Instead, there was only quiet joy and anticipation of the life ahead. Thomas Whitfield appeared at her door as the women were making final adjustments to her appearance. He had forsaken his usual ranch clothes for a proper suit, and his face bore an expression of mingled pride and wistfulness. "Your mother would be so proud of you today, Rosie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You look just like her." Rose embraced him carefully, mindful of her dress. She would be proud of you too, Papa, of how far you've come. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. The man who had nearly drowned in grief and whiskey was gone, replaced by the father she remembered from her childhood, strong, reliable, loving. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Been working on it for months." He handed her a small wooden box, beautifully carved with roses and vines. When Rose opened it, a gentle melody began to play, her mother's favorite hymn. "Oh, Papa," she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "It's beautiful. Something old for your wedding day," he explained. "And something to remember where you came from, even as you begin your new life." The journey to the church passed in a blur. Rose hardly noticed the spring landscape rolling by outside the wagon windows. Her thoughts focused on the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. Timber Creek had turned out in force for the wedding. The small church was filled to capacity with Triple D hands, townspeople who had come to know Rose during her months at the ranch, and even a few of Keegan's friends from neighboring spreads. As Thomas escorted her down the aisle, with Rebecca toddling ahead scattering flower petals with Sophia's help, Rose's eyes sought and found Keegan's. He stood tall and straight at the altar, dressed in a new black suit, his usually wind-tousled hair neatly combed. But it was the expression on his face that caught and held her: wonder, love, and a joy so intense it nearly took her breath away. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional. They spoke the ancient vows clearly, their voices steady with conviction. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Keegan leaned down to kiss her with gentle reverence, applause broke out among the assembled guests. The celebration continued at the Triple D, where tables had been set up in the yard and decorated with more wildflowers and ribbons. Alina and her kitchen helpers had outdone themselves, preparing a feast that would be talked about for years to come. As the afternoon mellowed into evening, there was music and dancing, laughter, and a few sentimental tears. Rose danced with her father, with Douglas, with several of the hands who had become like brothers to her. But it was the dances with Keegan that she would remember most clearly, the way he held her as if she were precious beyond measure, the private smiles they exchanged, the whispered words meant for no one else. As the sun began to set, casting long golden light across the ranch yard, Keegan took her hand and led her away from the celebration, toward where their horse and buggy waited. "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, the new name sending a thrill through her. Rose nodded, turning to where Hannah stood holding a sleepy Rebecca. "Take good care of her," she said as she kissed her sister's forehead. "As if she were my own," Hannah promised. "You two enjoy your first night in your new home. This little one will be fine until you return." The short journey to their cabin was filled with a new kind of anticipation. The past 2 months had seen the completion of the interior furniture built by Keegan and Thomas, curtains sewn by Rose, a colorful rag rug before the hearth that had been a gift from Alina. But this would be their first night there as husband and wife, the true beginning of their life together. Keegan insisted on carrying her across the threshold, setting her down gently in the main room where a fire had been laid ready in the hearth. Someone Rose suspected, Hannah had filled vases with wildflowers and placed them throughout the cabin. The bed in the main bedroom had been made up with fresh linens and strewn with rose petals. "Welcome home," Keegan said softly, drawing her into his arms. Rose leaned against him, savoring the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "Home," she echoed, the word filled with meaning it had never held before. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Rose's head resting on Keegan's chest, his arms holding her close, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperation and theft to love and marriage, from strangers to husband and wife. "What are you thinking about?" Keegan asked, his voice low in the darkness. "How strange life is," Rose replied. "How a moment that seemed like the worst, being caught stealing, turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." Keegan's hand stroked her hair gently. "God works in mysterious ways, my mother always said." She was right. Rose propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, his face barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I love you, Keegan Dawson. And I love you, Rose Dawson." He pulled her down for a tender kiss. "For all the days of my life." Epilogue, summer 1884. The summer sun beat down on the Triple D, turning the meadows golden and warming the earth. From the porch of their cabin, Rose watched as Keegan taught Rebecca how to guide a gentle mare around the small corral they had built. At 7 years old, Rebecca was tall for her age, with their mother's honey-brown hair and a confidence that came from growing up loved and secure. On a blanket in the shade nearby, their 2-year-old son Thomas played with wooden blocks, occasionally looking up to check that his mother was still watching. Beside him, 6-month-old Hannah slept peacefully in a cradle Keegan had carved during the long winter evenings. 5 years of marriage had brought changes both to the cabin, now expanded with an additional bedroom and a larger kitchen, and to the family that filled it. Rebecca had grown from a baby dependent on Rose's care to a spirited girl who called Keegan Pa, and who had only the faintest memories of the hardships that had marked her earliest months. Thomas Whitfield still worked at the Triple D, though he now had a small cabin of his own near the main house. He had remained sober, finding in ranch work and his growing family all the purpose he needed to keep the demons of grief at bay. The Delaney's continued to treat Rose and Keegan as family rather than employees. Douglas had gradually ceded more responsibility for the ranch's operation to Keegan and David, allowing the older man more time to enjoy his grandchildren, both Michael, now 9, and the Dawson children, whom he doted on equally. Alina remained the heart of the Triple D kitchen, though she now grudgingly admitted that Rose's biscuits had finally achieved perfection. The older woman had become like a grandmother to Rebecca and the younger children, teaching them Spanish words and telling them stories of her youth in Texas. As Rose watched Keegan help Rebecca dismount, their daughter's face alight with pride at her accomplishment, contentment settled over her like a warm blanket. This life, this family, was more than she could have dreamed of on that desperate day when hunger and fear had driven her to steal. Keegan looked up, catching her eye across the yard, and smiled that full, unguarded smile that still made her heart skip. He said something to Rebecca, who nodded and began leading the mare back to the small stable, then crossed the yard to join Rose on the porch. "She's a natural," he said, settling beside her on the bench and draping an arm around her shoulders. "Takes after her mother, determined, fearless." Rose leaned into his embrace, the familiar scent of him, leather, horses, the soap she made herself wrapping around her like a caress. "I was thinking about the first time we met," she admitted. "How different everything might have been if you hadn't been the one to catch me that day." Keegan's arm tightened around her, "But I was, and I'll be grateful for that every day of my life." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I still maintain you stole more than feed that day." Rose looked up at him, eyebrows raised in question. "You stole my heart, Rose Whitfield Dawson," he said simply, "and I never want it back." As their lips met in a tender kiss, Rose silently thanked God for second chances, for mercy shown by a stranger, and for the love that had transformed a desperate act of theft into the beginning of a beautiful life.